Hey everybody, welcome back. So you may notice the video quality is a little bit different this time around. I have a lens that's being sent in for repair, so in the meantime I'm using my iPhone, which is still 4K, so you can still see every blemish and wrinkle and gray hair that I have, so enjoy that. Anyway, this episode is going to be pretty film-centric. A few years back when I first got back into film, I would send out my film to get processed and scanned by a local lab. And over the course of the first few months of me getting back into film, I'd send it out to different labs. While I enjoyed the look that I was getting from film and the different stocks that I was shooting, there was something to be desired for the quality of the scans that I was getting back. Not just the quality and sharpness and things like that, but the dynamic range, the color that I was looking for weren't quite what I had in mind. So I did a little experiment. I decided to go out and get a flatbed scanner. In this case, it was an Epson V800. It's the one that I still use today. And I wanted to see if I could scan at home and get results that I really liked, to get a lot more control over how the finished product turned out. Now, coming from shooting digital at that point for quite a while and shooting in RAW, I was used to having the kind of latitude in adjusting exposure and white balance and making those sorts of creative decisions at the moment of bringing it into the computer. And after being used to that and kind of losing a lot of that ability when getting the scans done elsewhere, it was rewarding for me to be able to do the scans at home and really take control, because I'm a bit of a control freak, as some of you watching this video might also be. So after learning the ropes and figuring out how to scan properly and how I like to process things, I ended up with results that I was really happy with, and they were far superior to what I was getting from the different labs. Now, photo labs, they have a lot to contend with. They have different film stocks coming in. They don't necessarily have an engineer looking at every photo, making sure you're getting the most out of it. There are labs that do a great job, and they take a lot of creative control out of your hands when they do the scans. So I wanted to see what I can come up with on my own. So I initially started using Epson Scan, the software that sort of by default is used by the scanner, by Epson scanners. And while that was great, my scanner also came with a copy of SilverFast, which is a little bit more of an advanced application, something where you can really take control and get really a much better result out of. So I messed around with SilverFast for a while and was amazed at the film profiles that they had that were able to correct some of the color casts that different stocks of film had. And I was really happy with how I was able to kind of massage those images and get files that I was much happier with. So today I'm going to go over a few negatives, a few shots that I took several years back that I had scanned at professional labs and that I ended up processing myself as well. To kind of contrast and compare, to show you just how much latitude you can get out of a negative, just how much raw information that you can get with just a little bit of processing, and maybe encourage those of you that are interested in a DIY approach to actually go and scan yourselves. Scan your negatives yourself. And if you shoot black and white film as well, which we're not going to be going over today, but if you shoot black and white and you develop at home, you could go from taking the picture to developing it to scanning it, having a digital file of it in the same day. So today I'm going to go through 3 examples of photos that I took during that time. We're going to compare it to the lab files, and I'll show you what I did to get the best result from my estimation. All right, so let's jump into SilverFast. Okay, here we are in SilverFast 8.8. This is the software that came with my Epson V800 flatbed scanner. You may be using some other software. I like SilverFast a lot because it gives me a lot of control and granularity in how I'm creating these scans. It also allows me to come up with a closer to finished result straight out of the software before taking it into Photoshop and Lightroom to make some minor adjustments. So this is my software of choice, but you're welcome to use anything that you like. So I've done a pre-scan of the film bed, or rather the scanner bed, and I've got a film holder there with a 35 millimeter film strips in there, and I'm going to resize my little bounding box here to highlight just the frame that we're going to be working on to start with. And then I'm going to use this tool here to rotate the canvas counterclockwise so I can get a better idea of what the image looks like. I'm also going to zoom into this, and it's going to create a more detailed scan of that particular frame so I have a better idea of what I'm working with. Alright, it's completed the zoomed in scan. I'm just going to readjust this bounding box just to give the frame a little bit more of an accurate crop. So that's one less thing that I need to do after the fact. There we go. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this unsharp masking that's on by default by clicking this little X button. I prefer to do my sharpening in Photoshop or Lightroom rather than in the scanner software. The next thing I'm going to do is adjust the resolution. I know my scanner has a pretty good, can resolve a pretty good amount of detail up to about 2400 ppi. So I'm going to select that amount right there. And what this dialog tells you is that at 300 ppi, which is a pretty detailed print resolution, this will end up with a print of about 8 by 12, 8 by 10, somewhere around there. So it's a pretty decent sized print for a 35 millimeter negative. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust this Negafix dialog here. This is going to allow me to select the type of film that I use and the speed of that film. And SilverFast has a profile to give me a good starting color balance and color correction for that film. So this particular frame was shot on Kodak Portra 400. So I'm going to select Kodak and Portra, and this is the 400 variant. And it's already gotten me a pretty good color correction based on that kind of film. There's a couple different options here as well. There's the exposure, which will increase or decrease the brightness of the scan based on stops that you'd be familiar with when taking the picture. This looks pretty good at its standard setting. I'm going to drop it just a little bit to give me a little more detail outside this window here. Now remember that in the scan from the lab, this process was done automatically, so all the detail outside the window was blown out completely. All right, so we're going to try to retain some of that. So I've dropped the exposure a little bit. Tolerance here, that has to do with the orange mask that's found on film negatives. It helps to correct for any color cast that might result from that sort of. You notice that film negatives tend to have an orange coloration to them if it's a color negative. But I think this setting looks pretty good for me. The next thing I'm going to do is do a little bit of white balance correction or gray balance correction. Find a good neutral gray in this image to correct the colors just a little bit more. The way I do that is I'm going to select the pipette here. I'm going to select a neutral point, and I'm going to find something in the image that should be kind of a neutral gray. In this case, this Coca-Cola sign here, the lighter portion of this sign, seems close enough to a neutral gray to get a good color cast correction. So I'm going to select that. And as you can see, it warmed up the image a little bit. This is a lot closer to what it looked like when I was there. Now this is pretty close to a good starting point to take into Photoshop. One thing I like to do is click on this histogram button on the upper bar here. And that's going to show me the distribution of tones throughout the image. Notice that we don't really have any clipped shadows here, and we don't really have any clipped highlights. Now I can make adjustments to that if there are parts of the image I didn't really care for, but when I'm getting a scan out of the scanning software, I want to capture as much of that dynamic range as possible so that when I'm working with it in Lightroom or Photoshop, I have a lot more to work with. It's like using a RAW file if you've shot digitally. So I'm going to make sure that I'm not clipping shadows or highlights in this image. Now you can also drag this midpoint slider here to brighten the midtones in the image. And I sometimes do that if the scan looks a little dark or a little too bright. You can kind of adjust that to your liking. I think this has a pretty good amount of contrast right out of the scan here. But I'm going to pump that up just a little bit to give me a little more detail in the brighter, or rather the darker midtones, and this wood paneling here in the shadow regions. All right, so I think this is a good foundation here, and now let's move on to the next one. I'm going to do one more thing before I move on to the next negative. Something I do with all color negatives is I'm going to use this ISRD button. And when I click on that, what that does is it does two scans of the negative. One, a traditional color scan, and then it does a secondary scan using the infrared channel of the scanner, and it uses that information to find out where there's dust and scratches that might be apparent on the negative, and uses an intelligent algorithm to remove those automatically. Now, I find this works really, really well, and it saves a lot of time, especially if you're scanning a lot of negatives at once. So I have this on for pretty much all of my negative scans, color negatives. It doesn't quite work with black and white negatives because of the chemistry there, but with color negatives, it works amazingly well. I leave this set to automatic, and it does a pretty good job of clearing out the dust and scratches that might be apparent. Okay. Now that I have all the settings for this negative that I quite like here, I'm going to click on this little frame button, and I'm going to duplicate that frame. So it's going to apply all those settings to a new frame of the same size, so it saves time in scanning the next negative. The next one I'm going to work with is this one right here. Drag it on to this next negative. I'm going to rotate the canvas clockwise, and I'm going to zoom into this image again. All right, here we are zoomed in to get a better idea of what the scan looks like. I'm going to adjust the bounding box a little bit so that we have a better framing of this particular frame. Now, there are a few settings I need to change here. I'm going to X out the histogram there, and I'm going to X out the neutral pipette because this is a different image, remember. Next, I'm going to change this negafix dialog here to match the film that I took this photo with. This was actually shot on Kodak Ektar, so I'm going to select Ektar, and it was Ektar 100. For some reason, this particular profile ends up with pretty overexposed settings, so I'm going to dial back the exposure on that quite a bit. And this is a much more neutral starting place. Now, most of the other settings will be about the same. I'm using the same resolution, using that ISRD to remove dust and scratches. Now, this image is a little cool for my taste. I'm going to make a couple of adjustments to bring this down to reality. The first thing I'm going to do is open up the histogram, and I'm going to drag this midpoint slider, midtone slider, down just a little bit. And this gives me a better exposure for this image. Next, what I'm going to do is use the global color correction, which is this button on the top panel here. Click on that. And that allows me to correct for any color casts that are in the scan before doing a final scan. I could drag this point right here in the middle to adjust the overall color tone of everything wherever I'd like. Now I want to remove a little bit of magenta, and I want to add a little bit of warmth. So I'm going to drag this point a little toward the green and a little toward the yellow. Just a hair. Great. Now, Kodak Ektar is a very saturated film and generally not used for skin tones, but as we'll find out when we take this into Lightroom, you can actually get some really rich color from Ektar, even when shooting skin tones. So I think this is a good foundation for this image. Let's move on to the next one. All right, now I'm going to duplicate that frame once more by clicking on this frame button, duplicate, or you can hit Control or Command D if you're using Windows or Mac. I'm gonna move this bounding box to the next frame. There we go. This one's a little more difficult because it's a very dark frame with not a lot of detail to show you the difference between the holder and the frame itself, but that's okay. We're going to zoom into this next one. All right, here is a closer look at this frame here. Now, what I've done to start with is I've closed the histogram and global color correction from the previous frame because I want to kind of reset those, and because this is a different shooting situation, even though it's the same film stock. So as it's the same film stock, I'm going to use the same negafix settings, Kodak Ektar 100, and the exposure dialed back quite a bit. Now, as you can see, if we go to the histogram here, we've still captured a great deal of the shadow region, and we haven't blown out any of the highlights. Even though there's a great deal of dynamic range in this image, the film has been able to capture all of it. So that's a really good starting point. One thing I might change is a little bit of color correction. So I'm going to go to global color correction up here again, and I'm going to drag this little point a little toward the yellow or orange end of things just to warm up the image just a little bit. Now you can do a lot of these adjustments in Photoshop or Lightroom, but I like to get a good foundation to start with straight out of the scanning software, so there's less to do after the fact. So I think that's a good starting point for this image. We're going to take all these images into Lightroom and adjust them from here. All right, here we are in Lightroom, but you can do these same adjustments that I'm going to do in Photoshop, Adobe Camera Raw, GIMP, or really any image editing software of your choice. They're just basic adjustments. So the first thing I want to do is help dial in the dynamic range just a little bit. I'm going to bring the highlight slider down. And as you can see, if I go crazy with this, you can actually see pretty clearly outside of that window, which is amazing for how much dynamic range there is in this image. I'm not going to go crazy with it though, just bring a little bit more detail back in. I'm going to lift the shadows just a little bit as well. Great. Next, I'm going to add a little bit more contrast to the overall image by doing a very gentle S-curve. Gentle S-curve. Not sure why I said that. On the tone curve here, I'm going to select the lower mid-tones and bring them down just a little bit, and the upper mid-tones and bring them up just a little bit. And that helps bring in a little bit more contrast. The next thing I want to do is this Coca-Cola sign here is a little bit more orange than I would like. It's a little bit, it should be a richer red. So I'm going to the HSL panel here, selecting the hue portion of the panel, and this little dot here is going to allow me to select a particular color and adjust the hue of it. So I'm going to select that red, and I'm going to bring it down just a little bit to give it more of a richer red color. All right. Now, the last thing that I'm going to do with this image is sharpening. So I'm going to... So the next thing I'm going to do with the image is just to massage it a little bit to get a little bit more contrast out of it. Now I don't want this window to blow out again, so I'm going to select the radial filter. I'm going to create a little ellipse here or a circle that covers that window. And this effect is going to be applied, the filter that I'm going to use is going to be applied on everything except for the stuff inside of the filter. So I'm going to reset that filter there. I'm going to bring up just the whites a little bit. And that's going to bring up the lighter tones in this outside area here. And then I'm going to bring down the blacks just a little bit to give me a little bit more contrast. And we can kind of massage these a little bit to our liking. And I think I'm pretty happy with that. Great, so we've added a little bit more local contrast to the areas within the interior of this shack here, but we haven't blown out the window again. Now, the last thing I do with all these images is sharpening. It's very important because the scans will turn out quite soft to start with. So I'm going to zoom into a portion that has a fair amount of detail. I'm going into the detail panel here, and I'm going to increase the sharpening to close to about 100. These scans tend to require a fairly heavy-handed approach to sharpening, so somewhere around there. If I hold down Alt and I can drag this slider here, it gives me a black and white representation so I can see just what that sharpening is doing. So I'll leave it around 100. A radius, I'm going to hold down Alt and click on this radius slider, and it's going to tell me sort of how wide of an effect it's going to have on these edges. So usually with 35mm film I put it about 1.2, which makes that sharpening more evident. And then the detail slider, I'm holding down Alt again, and I'm going to drag this. So if I go all the way to 100, it's going to sharpen a lot of the grain more so than I'd like. I'm going to dial it down just a little bit so I really just get the important edges, and then release. All right, well, let's look at a little before and after sharpening so we can see how much detail we brought back into the image. That's before, and that's after. Before and after. And a little bit of that grain is really actually quite nice. It's one of the reasons we shoot film. And I'm going to zoom back out. All right, let's look at a comparison between the lab scan and the one that we've done here at home. Now, as you can see, in the lab scan, all of these shadows are blocked up pretty badly. There's not a lot of detail to be found. And conversely, the highlight region outside this window is blown almost to bits. There's really no detail out there. The image overall is actually fairly muddy because of that. In our home scan, we've been able to reel in the dynamic range that's already been captured by that film and actually given ourselves a lot more detail than in the scan. So let's zoom in to a particular portion here. As you see, the sharpness is pretty comparable after we've done a little bit of sharpening in post. But overall, the color is better, the contrast is better, the dynamic range is better captured. Okay, this next image is a picture of my wife. This is taken in San Francisco while we're having lunch a few years back. Now, there's not really too much to do with this image. I think the scan looks pretty good and pretty neutral. I'm going to do a couple of things just to punch it up a little bit. I'm going to go to the tone curve here, and I'm going to increase the contrast by creating a little bit of an S-curve, selecting a point in the lower midtones, dragging it down, and a point in the upper midtones and dragging it up. Just a little bit. Oh, not too much. There we go. All right. Next, the skin tone actually looks quite good, but I want to adjust it just a little bit. Ektar is known for its very vibrant colors. It's not generally a film you'd use for portraits, but in a pinch, and in this particular image, I think we can end up with some really good skin tones. So I'm going to the HSL panel here, selecting hue, selecting this little dot here, and I'm going to select just a skin tone somewhere in here and drag it down just a little bit to bring a little bit more reddish sort of pink into the skin and less orange. There we go. I'm going to go to the saturation portion of this panel, select that little dot again, and I'm going to drag that down a little bit as well, just to desaturate the skin tone just a little bit. And you can do this to your taste. Excellent. Now, the last thing I can do is add a little bit of warmth to the overall image by going to the temperature slider, +2. There we go. All right. The last thing I do, as with all images, is I'm going to zoom in here. I'm going to go to detail. I'm going to adjust the amount of sharpening up to about 100, maybe a little bit less. I'm going to adjust the radius to about 1.2. Again, I'm holding down the Alt button to show me exactly what's being sharpened and at what degree. So about 1.2 looks good to me. And the detail, I'm going to slide this back and forth. Again, if I go up to 100, you can see all that grain is being sharpened. We don't want to increase the sharpness in the grain too much. So I'm going to dial this down until it's really just the details, the outlines of her face, and the background that are being sharpened. Excellent. Now again, a before and after sharpening, before and after. You see, we've just brought back the detail that's inherent there in the film. Perfect. Now let's compare this with the lab scan. Now, as you can see in the lab scan, it didn't really know how to handle Ektar. The colors are quite garish, really vibrant, overly warm. The skin tone is completely off. And while it looks really punchy, it's not quite a great example of a portrait in my estimation. If we zoom in here, we can see the skin tone looks a lot better. The lighting is a lot more neutral. The exposure is better. We haven't blown out the highlights in the image. Also, if we look at this yellow, this vase of flowers here, of yellow flowers, now in the scan, the saturation of the yellow is completely blown out. There's no detail there. But in our home scan, we've been able to get a lot of detail back into that. Excellent. Okay, for this last image, this was taken at Land's End National Park. I think it's a national park in San Francisco as we're emerging out of a tunnel. It's my wife again. She has the burden of being the subject of so many of my photos, but she doesn't seem to mind too much. Anyway, this is a really good example of a huge dynamic range that is difficult to capture even on digital. There's a lot of detail that needs to be recovered in the highlights and the shadow regions. Now this is actually pretty close to how I'd want to finish the image, but I'm going to do a couple things. I'm going to draw down the highlights just a little bit. I'm going to lift the shadows just a little bit to bring more detail into the cave. I'm going to decrease the black level just a little bit to make the darkest regions here on the outskirts a little bit darker to improve contrast. Then I'm going to increase the color temperature a little bit just to warm up the image just slightly because it was a nice and sunny day. And lastly, I'm going to do a little sharpening. We're going to zoom into an area, maybe this graffiti on this pedestal out here. Go down to detail. We're going to increase the sharpening again to about 100. We're going to increase the radius. I'm holding down Alt again to see what's being affected. Increase the radius to about 1.2. That's what I usually do with 35mm film. And then I'm going to hold down Alt again and slide this detail slider. Again, if I go to 100, it sharpens the grain. We don't really want that. I'm going to dial it back until we're really just getting her silhouette and the detail regions in the image. Excellent. Now again, a little before and after sharpening. Before and after sharpening. See a lot more detail in the graffiti over here, a lot more detail in the rock in this tunnel here. And we're zooming out to fit again. As you can see in the lab scan, a lot of the shadow regions here are completely crushed. The highlights are right on the edge of completely blowing out. You can see it in the sky. And there's just a lot of detail that's being lost in the scan. The color is also, it has a color cast, a little bit of a magenta color cast. That is fixable, but because it's a JPEG, there's not so much that can be done with it after the fact. But in our scan, it's a lot more of a natural result. We've captured all of the dynamic range, and it really gives this sort of air of mystery, and I really like the way that her silhouette is framed with the rocks out on the water and this sort of pedestal in front. And you can really get these elements a lot more clearly in the home scan. Thank you so much if you stuck through to the end. Thanks for following along. I hope you were able to get an impression of just the amount of latitude, the amount of quality that you can get out of these negatives if you scan them yourself, if you can take creative control over those negatives. If you have any questions about SilverFast or Lightroom or Photoshop in regards to processing color negatives or any kind of film that you're scanning, please let me know. Let me know in the comments. If you had a preference between the lab scan and our home scan, let me know that as well. If you really liked this video, and I hope you did, please remember to leave me a like, subscribe to my channel, check me out on Instagram at MatthewArringtonPhoto, or check out my website at MatthewArrington.com. I hope this has been of some help to you, and I'll see you next time.